Amanda is my brother's girlfriend. At the time of this story, she was looking for her first apartment and moving out from her parents' house. Her and my brother didn't want to move in together since they had only dated for a few months. She opted instead to search for a roommate online. Browsing Craigslist, she found an ad titled something like, "Roommate wanted, females only." This sort of thing was common since the area she was looking in was mostly young professionals. The listing was for a room in a house for about $225 a month, which was quite cheap. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student that wasn't comfortable with living with any males. The other roommates would have their own room, an attached bedroom. So far, Amanda was into this place. However, the listing only had a single photo from outside the property. Amanda sent an email wanting to meet the occupant and tour the house. Within 30 minutes, she received an email back with all the details and a time to stop by. The girl worked late hours and wanted Amanda to stop by at 8 p.m. When Amanda arrives, there is a handwritten note on the front door saying, "Door broken, use back door." Walking around the house, it looks nice but slightly unkempt. Tall grass, weeds, dusty windows, etc. Still no alarms for Amanda though. When she knocks on the back door, an older man opens the door. At first, Amanda thinks she has the wrong house, but the man reassures her and says that the occupant was out and he was the landlord. The occupant asked him to meet Amanda since she was working late. He seemed pleasant and offered to show her around. Alarms started going off, but we aren't at red alert yet. First, the guy was clearly in his 40s, unshaven, and looked like he lived in his car. Also, only the kitchen light was on. As they walked around the house, Amanda noticed one huge red flag. There was no furniture, nothing. The landlord was polite about answering questions, but seemed irritable about keeping lights on for too long, rushing her around, and only letting her look at rooms for a few moments. There was a single room that the landlord wouldn't open, telling her that it was the occupant's room and he didn't want to invade her privacy. As they walk down the hallway into the living room, she notices the front door has a plank nailed across it. Amanda's alarm bell started to ring, so she decides to wrap up the walkthrough and leave, but trying to be polite. As she's thanking the guy for showing her around, he perks up and states that he forgot to show her the basement. It's recently furnished and would be a great rec room, and she should take a look down there. At the time, Amanda and the landlord are standing in the small hallway between the front living room and the back kitchen. In this little hallway was the basement door. When he opens the door, it opens outwards to create something of a barrier between Amanda and the back door. The basement is pitch black. He smiles, motions down the stairs and says, "Ladies first." What happens next is nothing more than a stroke of luck. Amanda receives a text message just as some random person parks in front of the house. Thinking on her feet, she pretends it's a phone call and answers her phone. "Hey, yeah, are you here? I'll come out from around back and let you in. It's great, you have to see it." With a motion of confidence, she excuses herself around the landlord and walks out of the back door. She says the guy just looked at her like he was confused. Once outside, she sprinted to her car and sped out of there. When Amanda got home, she told her mother and my brother everything. Police were called, they took her statement and went to investigate. The Craigslist post had been removed. The house had been foreclosed over 6 months earlier, and the property had been abandoned. When the police investigated, they found that the closed room the landlord didn't want her to look in was where the man had been staying. There was a pile of old, dirty blankets, rotten food, and empty gallon jugs everywhere. More creepy was that he had plastered ripped-up pages from adult magazines all over the walls in the room. The really scary part of this was the basement. The man had tied a thin piece of fishing wire about shin level across the stairs about halfway down. The basement was empty except another pile of old blankets and a broom handle wrapped in leather belts, and a small box containing a few rolls of duct tape. About 5 years ago, I set out to travel the world. Being straight out of college had left me in debt, ever more desperate for any job I was overqualified for and generally depressed. I felt isolated and alone in my small town in Washington and found the only way to get out was to travel. My high school buddy suggested I look into volunteering as a way to travel cheap, and so I did. The way it works is quite simple. You work for around 25 hours a week on some farm for food and housing. The draw is that since the community of cheap travellers is quite big, it is a great way to meet new people, get outside of your comfort zone, and just let yourself live and figure life out. Fast forward 8 months and I'm a seasoned volunteer. I started out in Washington and went south to Carolina. There I was able to save money I was paid for under the table for some extra work and was now faced with a decision, where to go in the world. The excitement of being able to purchase a ticket to almost anywhere in the world got the best of me, and on the advice of my hippie volunteering partner, I chose it at random. I went to a randomizer website and clicked the country button. The country of Georgia. To say I didn't know anything about it was an understatement, but the fear of the unknown made it exciting and exotic somehow, so I did it. I purchased a ticket and started browsing for a farm that could host me. There were a few options, and most were remote and hadn't even had an internet connection. I messaged every single one, because few ever respond, and got a response from one farm on top of a mountain. The pictures showed a traditional Georgian stone house with a large garden out in the back, a family with several cheerful children, grandparents having dinner, and animals. It seemed warm and inviting. The description was written in good English and the requirements for work seemed reasonable. I was excited. After I flew into Tbilisi, the capital, I followed the directions that they have sent to locate the farm, which wasn't an easy task. Few people in Georgia speak English, and the roads are pretty bad since few have been maintained since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country is generally poor. It took me around 20 hours of Soviet buses and taxis, weird serpentine roads, and paths to get to the desired blue pin on my map. It was a dirt path leading up a steep hill into a national park up in the north of the country. There was nothing for miles on end but trees and their silence. As I got up the hill, I saw the house about half a mile away on an even steeper hill, surrounded by trees. From that viewpoint it seemed abandoned, overgrown, brown and dreary. As I walked past the gate, the apparent owner approached me. He was a heavy, small, middle-aged guy with a big smile on his face. He shook my hand and in broken English started to show me around. He also smelled of booze. As he was showing me around, I noticed that there wasn't anyone there but us. I asked about his wife and kids and he brushed that aside and said something to the extent of, "They're away right now." By this point I am creeped out. From browsing around it was apparent that the farm was in deep decline. Apple trees and crops were dying, the roof of the small barn caved in, the house itself full of trash and smelling of mould. It was obvious that the owner was going through a rough patch, but I wasn't going to turn around and just leave in the middle of nowhere without a plan, having not slept for the past 36 hours. It was evening, and after feeding me well and trying as best as he could to hold a conversation in English, the owner showed me my room on the second floor and I went to sleep. I almost immediately blacked out from the exhaustion and stress, and would have slept for 10 hours if I wasn't awoken by a strange noise in the middle of the night. It sounded like something metallic and heavy was being dragged across the wooden floor. In that sleepy in-between state, I listened to it for a few minutes, thought nothing of it, and went back to sleep once it had stopped. In the morning, the owner, now sober and grumpy, asked me to repair some windows and doors in the house, as he himself planned to go and fetch some components in a nearby village. Again, I got this weird feeling creeping down my spine. Something wasn't right. He didn't maintain eye contact with me and was evasive. There was no cell reception and no internet. Once he left, I checked around the house to get the general idea of the place, and it became apparent that the place was hardly ever lived in. Like one of those abandoned houses, there was broken furniture, newspapers, and old photos on the floor, and a shattered mirror. I took my phone and looked through the saved listing again. The photos didn't match neither the backyard, the garden, or the walls. The owner wasn't in any of them. It was a completely different house. Now by this point I'm full-blown panicking. I pack my stuff and start to leave when I see a group of 3 men going up that first hill. There aren't any other paths I can take, so I go behind the house and rush down this hill into the forest. After some time I stop and listen. I hear them in the house. They're clearly looking for me. Afraid of making any noise, I remain still, hidden behind a bush. I don't know how long I wait, but they were persistent. At some point I hear them leave, so I count until some large number and proceed back into the house and path, and once I find it's all clear, I get the hell out of there. I never ran this fast, but I am still in the middle of nowhere, no traffic, no public transport. I reach a paved road and start walking in the general direction from where I remember coming from. Hours go by, and finally a car drives by and stops. Now, in a horror movie, this would have been the owner and his friends, but this was actually a really nice Russian family that gave me a ride into town. The listing disappeared from the website in a few days after I left, and I haven't heard from the owner since. I'm yet to make sense of that experience. I have travelled since and volunteered too. Some people, once they hear this story, laugh and say the guy was coming over with a couple of friends from the village to have a chat over a few beers, and then some say he was bound to kidnap and kill me. But I trust my gut feeling, something was really not right, so let's never meet again. It was the end of 2018, our first getaway together as a couple. We went to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. We were naive. We thought it would be more romantic to camp out as far off the beaten track as possible. We walked really far into the wilderness and got to a spot where nobody passed us all afternoon. We were making s'mores over the campfire after it had just gotten dark. It was twilight. All of a sudden, my boyfriend saw a man approaching us slowly. He was creeping up on us. At first, we thought it was a park ranger coming to tell us to put out our campfire. I began to hide the weed, thinking this was our biggest concern. My boyfriend called out to him, "Hey, can I help you?" We thought it was weird that he didn't have any kind of light on him. He didn't have any camping bag, nothing. Why was he out here so far with no camping gear at night, with no light? He sped up after my boyfriend called out and came right at him. He had this strange look in his eyes. The look was absent, blank and weird. He didn't answer my boyfriend. Alarm bells were ringing at this point. When my boyfriend realised it wasn't a park ranger, he quickly put his hand in his pocket where he had a concealed knife. He made it clear he had a weapon. It was only after my boyfriend did this that the guy acknowledged us. He said something weird. "Oh, I was just wondering if you all were having a party." Remember, we were miles away from a single soul, and it was beginning to get dark when he began to approach us slowly without a light. The only thing he had with him was a tiny drawstring bag on his back. After he asked what we were doing, we didn't give him any answers, but asked him what he was doing. He didn't answer. He just looked past my boyfriend towards the site. It was windy, so we had put up a tarp to shield ourselves. This also meant that the guy approaching us couldn't see how many people were at our site. He asked, "How many people have you got with you?" He began to circle our site to check us out. He asked again if we had any other people with us, and my boyfriend didn't answer. He carried on circling around our camp. Now, bear in mind, we had set up our camp on this crazy steep hill. It was the only spot for miles that was possible to put up a camp. However, he told us that he was going to set up camp nearby. He proceeded to walk off in a direction straight up the hill. We knew for a fact he couldn't put up a campsite there because of the terrain. But remember, he had no camping gear with him. We were silent. We listened to his footsteps on the leaves as he walked up the hill in this direction, completely off the path. We walked for about 30 seconds and then his footsteps stopped completely. He was just still, silent. We knew he was still there, but we couldn't see him. It was dark. At this point I was freaking out. I didn't want to seem like a pussy in front of my boyfriend. We had a talk about whether we needed to leave. My boyfriend handed me a knife and said if anything happens to him, I should run. At this point, I knew it just wasn't me freaking out unnecessarily. He said we needed to get out of there and just to grab essential items. I was scared that he was about to shoot us dead. Later on, when I told my boyfriend this, he said no. This is the type of guy who would probably prefer to stab his victims to death. We began to walk down the trail in the pitch black with our lights off for at least a mile. My boyfriend looked back to see him staring at one point. He ran behind me to protect me. This experience stuck with me. I still can't think of a rational or non-menacing reason why that guy was there that night. I've tried. Now this was at the end of 2018, but my boyfriend, who is now my husband, and I were remembering it last night. I decided to type into Google if there had been any murders in the same place around the same time. There was. A few months after our incident on the same trail, an unhinged man with crazy eyes approached some hikers at twilight as it was getting dark. He behaved in a deranged and aggressive manner before stabbing a man to death with a 17-inch knife. A woman he was with ran for her life down the trail. Finally, she raised her hands in surrender and he began to stab her. Somehow she managed to get away. The killer carried on wandering the trail and shouted out to other campers to give him a flashlight, but they didn't, thank goodness. All of the details from Google showed the same guy that approached us, same age, same deranged eyes, same lack of a flashlight, same time to approach us, same look, same place. The more articles I read, the more I realised this psychopath had been roaming the trails harassing hikers for a while. A few different people had reported him, not just us. Apparently, this erratic and violent psychopath was well known to law enforcement along the Appalachian Trail. His name is James Jordan. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I upload stories on a weekly basis, and please, sleep well.